Hello and welcome to another TLDR Brexit Explained video. You might remember that almost exactly a year ago, the UK officially left the European Union. Countdowns were projected, confetti was launched, flags were lowered and Farage shouted. A year later, the UK is making a big play, applying to join a new group of nations, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, the TPP is very different from the EU, as we'll explain in this video, but it's a bold move from the UK on the anniversary of Brexit, and could show some of Britain's vision going forward. Before we get going, a quick shout out to the TLDR merch store. If you use code TPP, you can get 10% off any order over the next 3 days. That means if you wanted to buy a pin badge representing your favourite country, maybe even a TPP one, then that's 10% off. Or if you missed our colouring book before it sold out at Christmas, then you can pre-order the brand new 2021 edition for 10% off. Anyway, the code's TPP and the link's down below. Before we start discussing the UK's application to the TPP and what this means for Britain, let's start by explaining the TPP more generally. The TPP, or more accurately the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, is a group of 11 countries, the TPP 11. These countries are Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore and Vietnam. There's obviously some big differences between the countries in that list, but one unifying factor is their location, which, as the name suggests, place them around the Pacific Ocean. In 2010 though, their connection became stronger than just sharing an ocean, when the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership was brought into force, with the ambition of becoming, when the US was still involved in negotiations, the world's largest free trade agreement. It would have covered some 40% of the world's economy, and a collective population bordering on 800 million people. With this power, they hope to exercise a huge amount of influence on the international stage, through a phenomenon similar to the Brussels effect. Like the EU, they hope that in controlling such a large proportion of the world's economy, they could push other countries through necessity to adhere to their rules, unless they wanted to be shut off from such a large trading bloc. But the very core of the agreement actually goes back even further to 2005, and a relatively niche trade agreement covering 4 Pacific Rim countries: Brunei, Chile, New Zealand and Singapore, better known as the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership Agreement, or the P4. The P4 greatly reduced tariffs, increased ease of access for service partners, brought in a newfound focus on shared innovation, reduced red tape on customs, as well as sanitary and phytosanitary procedures, alongside the removal of technical barriers to trade and the acceptance of most favoured nation treatment, in effect, putting in place the building blocks for a customs union. In 2008, the then President of the United States, George W. Bush, announced that the US would commence talks with the P4 group, which sparked other countries' interest in the grouping, with the likes of Australia, Vietnam, Peru, Canada, Japan, Malaysia and Mexico all beginning talks. Under Obama, talks continued until just 5 years after formally commencing negotiations, an agreement was concluded on the 5th of October 2015. This contained 30 chapters on everything from tariffs and intellectual property rights to dispute resolution mechanisms and environmental standards. At the core of this agreement, some 98% of tariffs were to be removed or reduced. Non-tariff barriers when it comes to services were also to be removed, protecting service providers from discrimination. Investment rules would also be loosened, with ISDS clauses, something we've discussed before, being included. Everything was in place for each country to sign and ratify. However, as a major party in the agreement, seen by many as the linchpin of the agreement, without the United States' signature on the dotted line, the agreement couldn't be put into force. To be taken into effect, the deal required ratification by February 2018 by at least countries representing at least 85% of the group's economic output. Given the size of the US economy, if the US wasn't on board, the 85% threshold could never be reached. Then, of course, in 2016, the US election happened, and the change in American leadership following the election of Donald Trump to the presidency ultimately led to America pulling out of the agreement, causing the agreement to have a massive great hole in it, legally, economically, and practically. Without US participation, the agreement in its current form could not go ahead. Undeterred, the remaining 11 nations pressed on with a slightly renamed Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, signed into force on March 2018. That, on the whole, was largely unchanged from the original TTP. At the heart of the agreement are two key concepts: rules and market access. On the rules front, CPTPP manages the relevant regulations underpinning trade, notably food safety regulations, as well as bans on the transfer of data, for example. On the market access front, as with the original TTP, the partnership resembles a relatively normal free trade agreement. In the words of the Institute for Government, the CPTPP provides for almost complete liberalisation of tariffs. Tariffs are retained in only a few highly sensitive areas. For example, Japan keeps tariffs on rice, while Canada's dairy industry is also protected. The agreement, at least originally, was designed in such a way to create a pathway to eventually forming a single market, replicating in part the European Union, with, as things stand now, the sum of the countries involved in the partnership totaling $10.6 trillion US, or 13.3% of the world's GDP. So that's some history and background about the grouping the UK is applying to join. Yes, I know, we spent like 6 minutes doing history and background, but I think it's interesting and important to learn a bit more about the grouping the UK is trying to join. The government's hoping that Britain will be admitted into the club, and that joining the fast-growing group of nations will boost the UK's exports and the British economy. Speaking to the BBC, International Trade Secretary Liz Truss said that in the future it's going to be the Asia-Pacific countries in particular where the big markets are, where growing middle-class markets are for British products. The government's clearly hoping that by joining, the UK could benefit from reduced tariffs on all kinds of UK exports, from cars to whiskey to the service sector. Now, I think it's probably worth tackling the elephant in the room here. This whole thing is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trans-Pacific, as in a deal that contains countries from across the Pacific. That makes sense when you look at the list of countries involved and plop them onto a map. They do indeed span the Pacific Ocean. Name a country that doesn't? The United Kingdom, a European nation thousands of miles away from the Pacific Ocean. Now, I'm being a little facetious here, but this is a genuine issue with the proposal. As we mentioned in our video about the proposed Kanzuk Agreement, even in a globalised world, geography matters. Now, in that Kanzuk video, I spent ages on this point, comparing different countries' main trading partners and illustrating that even outside the EU, the UK is still likely to do a lot more trade with its neighbours than it does with countries on the other side of the world. And this looks true again, as the TPP 11 countries only account for 8.4% of the UK's exports in 2019, which might sound impressive until you remember that Germany alone accounted for 9.9% of British exports that year, and the EU comes in at a combined nearly 45% of exports. With decreased tariffs and better links between countries, this would likely improve with the TPP, but it doesn't suddenly mean that British exporters will want to spend money shipping goods all over the world. It also has to be noted that Britain already has trade deals with 7 of the 11 countries, many of them deals carried over from EU membership. The UK is also working on deals with Australia and New Zealand, so once those deals are concluded, the UK will have deals in place with 9 of the 11 members, leaving only Brunei and Malaysia. So while joining the bloc could have some real benefits, it would only likely add 2 countries to the UK's deal tally. That's not to say that this is a total waste of time though. Britain joining the bloc could be beneficial for both sides, with the UK becoming the first new country to join and the second biggest economy in the agreement, which could, if it happened, facilitate greater trade in the region. The benefits would really emerge if the US joined though. Although Trump scrapped plans for the US's involvement, Biden hinted that he might consider the idea of joining. If America did join, then this would not only give the UK a deal with the US, one of the things that Johnson's government have wanted the most since Brexit began, but it would also increase the power of the bloc on the global stage. So short term, it looks like the benefits of joining the TPP might be limited, with the countries not being the most obvious trading partners and a number of deals already in place. However, it could pay off longer term, with trusts saying that plans like this are being put into place to deliver for Britain in 2030 and 2050. What do you think though? Let us know if you approve of Britain joining the TPP. Especially if you're from a TPP country. Has this been a big news story where you are? And do you want Britain to join your club? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified as this plays out, and so that we can update you on Britain's progress. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.